Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. So I'm playing my Dwarfs again, 2500 points, and I'm up against the Tomb Kings, using a similar list that I took to a recent tournament in the summer. However, in that list I had 2 organ guns with 2 master engineers, and both organ guns had the rune of accuracy on them. So it was a pretty much all guns blazing annihilator list, and I've softened it up a little bit. I've taken out one of the organ guns, taken out both of the master engineers, and instead I've gone for Belegar Ironhammer. It's my first time playing with Belegar Ironhammer, so I'm keen to see what he can do. I had this Lord model there with a hammer and shield on an Oathstone, so I think that's quite a fitting model to use for Belegar. Although I had used that model previously at last year's narrative event as King Cazador, who also had a sort of hammer and shield combo. So anyway, he's Belegar Ironhammer today. And of course, Belegar is quite handy. He's got a 3-up, 4-up. He gets +1 to wound in combat. He can double his attacks once per game. And crucially, he gives his units stubborn. So he's going to be, I think, in those Iron Breakers. The Iron Breakers as well obviously have a 3-up, 5-up in close combat. So if you can keep Belegar alive, that unit of Iron Breakers aren't going anywhere. So that's the core anvil of my army. I've also got 20 Longbeards with great weapons, 40 warriors with great weapons, 2 runesmiths, 1 Thane BSB, 1 cannon, 1 grudge thrower, and 3 gyrocopters. Just to talk then about some of the runes I've got on these guys, so I won't go through all of them, but the Longbeards have got the Ancestor rune on the banner, which is one of my favourites there. That lets them roll a break test on a single d6 once per game, which is just good when you sort of lose that crucial combat, and it's pivotal that you can stay in combat for another turn. Just keeps them in the game for that extra period of time. The BSB has got the Master Rune of Grugny, giving that crucial 5-up bubble against the shooting and magic missiles, and it gives him a 4-up ward himself. He's also got an Ancestor Rune as well, so he'll be going in the Warriors, which gives them that little bit of extra survivability in combat as well. And the Ironbreaker's got 2 runes of slowness. Now it's funny because it's my first time using the runes of slowness in a game, and I actually forget about it, as you'll find out soon. They only get charged once in the game, and they do a bit of charging themselves, but I sort of totally forget about it throughout the game, so not sure whether or not it would have made a difference, but let's have a go. Let's get into it. So the Tomb Kings then from left to right. It's funny, I don't play Tomb Kings often. I think this is only my second time playing Tomb Kings, and I'm always reminded of Steve from Mini Wargaming, who says whenever you're playing Tomb Kings, expect a Casket of Souls, and also expect to win, because they're notoriously not as good as some of the other armies, and the Casket of Souls is one of those units which is very good, probably a bit broken if it was in any other army, but in the Tomb King's army you kind of let it slide. So from left to right we've got 3 chariots. I think they've got a standard bearer as well. There's a brick there of, was it 25 or 30 skeleton warriors with full command? Actually, no musicians. That's right. There was no musicians in the army, so I think they've got a banner and champion. The casket at the back. There's a big brick of 40 or so what they call tomb guard with full command. In there, they've got the necrotect, and they've got a tomb king. At the back, then they've got the sort of wizard bunker there of the skeleton archers, and they've got another special character whose name is Katep, I think. Who is a level 4 lore master on the lore of Nekahara, and he's the army's hero titan. Moving along then, you've got the hero titan. Sorry, I said hero titan before, I meant hierophant. This is the hero titan, sort of hiding behind the building there. You've then got the war sphinx. You've then got another block of 25 skeletons full command, and then you've got on the flank there a sphinx, not a war sphinx, but some other sort of sphinx, the flying one anyway, with the decapitating blades out on the flank. So here we are, all set up for deployment. I've gone for a sort of typical sort of castle strategy at the back there, although I do have my general with my iron breakers sort of out front, and then my great weapon warriors and great weapon longbeards a bit further behind. We've got a long sort of hedge, as you can see, on the left-hand side of the table. I did warn Brennan in advance that the chariots wouldn't be able to march or charge. Well, they can't march anyway, being Tomb Kings, but they wouldn't be able to, charge over that hedge without taking dangerous terrain. But he was still comfortable putting the chariots there. Most of the monsters are on my right-hand flank. in terms of the war machines, as you can see, I've got my organ gun and cannon sort of between my blocks of dwarfs there. Everyone's sort of within the bubble of the Master and Agragni. Being Tomb Kings, obviously they've got the bows, which always hit on 5s. No catapults, no cavalry, so not much shooting going on there, but obviously he does have a vast array of spells. I'm not too familiar with the Nekakara, but I think it's mainly augments and hexes. You can actually see all of his cards in the top right there, because he's also got a couple of spells from the Hero Titan, which are bound spells, and of course there's that nasty spell from the Casket of Souls, which I found out had a range of 48 inches. He did drop it down on the table quite early though, and I was able to put my Grudge Thrower just out of range of the 48 inches on my sort of bottom right hand side of my deployment zone. I've got one gyro behind the house there, and I've got another couple of gyros on my right hand flank, although they've now got a Necrosphinx, I remember the name now, Necrosphinx in front of them on that flank. So those gyrocopters are going to have to be a bit careful not to get into the 48-inch range of the casket, and also see if they can fly over the top of that hovering Necrosphinx. On the Ancestral Grudge, I roll a 1, so it's my general hates his general. Belegar Ironhammer hates that Tomb King, and they're actually facing off each other in the middle of the board, so let's see if we can make that happen. So dwarfs get first turn, and turn 1 goes by pretty quickly because we don't do too much movement. I'm waiting for the Tomb Kings to sort of come at me a bit before I start thinking about what I'm going to do with my gyrocopters, so it's just a little bit of repositioning. However, my Ironbreakers do take a couple of steps to the right to open up a lane of fire for my organ gun into the Tomb Guard. So we let off a volley of shots. I take off a couple of wounds off that War Sphinx. I take off one wound of that casket with the Stone Thrower, and then I unleash with the organ gun into the Tomb Guard. I kill a handful, but then of course in Tomb King's turn 1 he starts casting with his all of his dice that are coming out of nowhere, and it's +1 to cast for this, +1 to cast for that, extra D3 for this. And the lore attribute, of course, is that he can get wounds back for each one of these augments that he casts on his unit. So he manages to get a handful of Tomb Guard back, much to my dismay, and he also manages to get regen, 5-up regen off on that big horde. So he's doing quite well in the magic phase. He also manages to bubble up this big move again spell. So he comes at me shambling a meager 4 inches, and then of course everyone gets to move again, and those chariots get up quite far on my left hand flank, and this War Sphinx is sort of coming at me in the middle. I've actually got 2 runes of Dispel Breaking, but I don't want to get drawn into using them just yet. At the end of the day, I want to obviously shoot these guys as much as possible, but I want to save that rune of Spell Breaking for when, of course, we get into close combat, and that's the point where I don't want him to get those augment spells off on his big unit. So let's just wait and see for now, but turn 1 goes quite quickly. So dwarfs turn 2, and now that the Tomb Kings have shown their cards and they're sort of all coming at me at full pelt, it now gives my gyrocopters the opportunity to fly over the top and get busy. So I've got one going up the left hand flank, sort of hides nicely behind a building there, and the 2 on the right hand flank go over the top of this Necrosphinx, trying to sort of figure out if they can go round to get that Casket of Souls, or be annoying and come in and try and block some charges or something. There's no big scalps in the shooting phase, but I do manage to take another wound or 2 off of this War Sphinx with the cannon, and this War Sphinx now is only on about 2 wounds remaining, so it's going to be pretty ineffective in combat, and I'm not sure it's got the guts to charge into that big horde of dwarf warriors, or indeed my Iron Breakers in the middle. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on the Tomb King's turn. The organ gun is shooting into that horde again, and manages to again take off another handful of Tomb Guard from that back rank. But then Tomb King's turn 2 comes in, and of course he's firing all these spells again. It's becoming really difficult with the amount of power dice he has each turn, and the amount of these sort of low-level augments that he can just pump out by getting, +1 to cast from this Hero Titan as well. it's becoming hard to actually do much lasting damage on this horde because he's just able to raise these tomb card again. So it's funny, at the beginning of the game I was sort of thinking, well, before the game rather, I won't take 2 organ gun with engineers because it's going to be a bit harsh on a Tomb King army that can't march and it's just coming at me slowly and I'm annihilating it with 2 organ guns. But actually, looking back on it now, it's probably better off I did that, because otherwise I'd be have a lot of points tied up in these organ guns, which aren't doing too much because he's been able to sort of raise his army up again as they're coming towards me. So in Tomb King's turn, he actually just marches that War Sphinx right up into my grill, as you can see there in front of the Dwarf Warriors. I think he's thinking now, well, this Tomb King, this War Sphinx isn't going to survive in combat, so let's just get that breath weapon off and see what we can do. And that's exactly what he does. And he flames a load of Dwarf Warriors and kills about 5 of them. But then, of course, he's in a sort of tasty position now, ready for the horde to charge into that War Sphinx and probably have enough to take it out in turn 3. So Dwarf's turn 3, and as you can see, the War Sphinx is on 3 wounds there. I think it went down to 2, but then went back up to 3 as they bubbled up that move again spell, and it moved quite close, as you can see, to put that flame template on the Dwarf Warriors, killing a handful of them, but opening itself up to the double charge from my units. So it's being pretty suicidal there, but thinking, go for that last Hail Mary before you die. So the Warriors charge in the front, the Ironbreakers charge in the side, and over on the left-hand flank, those chariots have got a little bit too close to those Longbeards, and I'm not sure Brennan noticed that, thinking he was sort of coming round the flank there, but they were just inside the charge arc of the Longbeards, and when we measured it, I think they needed something like a 7 or an 8, and they made it. So I've got a charge from those Longbeards, I've got a double charge in the middle, and I've also got a cheeky charge from my gyrocopter into his wizard bunker. Now, I'm not sure what I was thinking at the time, in terms of being able to tie up the wizard and get the wizard sort of unit to turn around. In the end, it didn't make too much difference because that wizard has got mainly augment spells and hexes, which it doesn't really need to be facing the right direction to have a line of sight to use. But it was tying up that unit nonetheless, in a combat with, gyrocopter being toughness 5, and those skeletons with a wizard in it aren't going to do too much to that gyrocopter. So it wasn't too bad getting that charge off as well. I've got another 2 gyrocopters which flied up that right hand flank to do some bombing runs on that skeleton unit, only killing a measly 1 skeleton, but in a quite central position now to do other things in turn 4. And in the close combat phase, it all went the way of the dwarves, so we managed to destroy that War Sphinx, only just actually, because it did quite a lot of wounds to us, but obviously with all our ranks and the flank charge and the BSB and everything, we were able to crumble that War Sphinx. And we did a bit of a reform, so those Ironbreakers actually exposed their flank to those skeleton warriors, because obviously Belagar Ironhammer is on a Oathstone, so I'm not going to get disrupted if that skeleton warrior unit charges the Ironbreakers in the flank, and the Dwarf Warriors reform out of a horde formation to face those skeleton warriors as well, just because they don't have enough space to get around the Ironbreakers otherwise. But it felt like a big swing to the dwarfs in turn 3. So Tomb King's turn 3, and the dwarfs are feeling pretty good at this point. However, we do have a big gap in the middle of the board, and my army is sort of split in 2. I've got my Longbeards on one side, the Ironbreakers and Warriors on the other, and my Organ Gun and Cannon in the middle by themselves, but looking pretty safe there because there's nothing really sort of bearing down on them just yet. However, there is this Necrosphinx bearing down on my Grudge Thrower on the right hand side, and of course that's exactly what happens. The Necrosphinx charges the Grudge Thrower and makes it in. The skeletons make it into the flank of the Ironbreakers. Of course, the Ironbreakers aren't too fussed about that because they are more concerned about facing that big horde in the middle. I hadn't measured the distance. I can't remember whether the horde tried to charge or whether just pivoted, but they didn't make it into combat in turn 3. The Hero Titan came out of its little hidey hole to try and get within 12 inch of the Katep to give him the buff, and sort of opening up the cannon shot to him on turn 4. So let's see how that goes. And in the combat phase, or the magic first, so the casket manages to get off the the big zap that it has, which I was dispelling quite successfully on turns 1 and 2, but to get it off on turn 3 onto my war machines, and luckily my organ gun and cannon passed their leadership test on 3d6. It was a bit touch and go, but I managed to keep my war machines alive from that this time. In the combat phase, those skeletons just fail abysmally against my Ironbreakers, which to be expected really, those Ironbreakers are pretty solid. But the the Necrosphinx fails to destroy all 3 crew of my Grudge Thrower, and one crew member there, valiantly stubborn of course, passes his leadership test and fights on. Not sure whether that's good or bad, because of course it means that the Necrosphinx will defeat the Grudge Thrower on my turn now, be able to charge next time. So those Dwarf Warriors are going to have to charge to pivot backwards to face it, but we'll see how that goes. So Dwarfs turn 4, and I'm particularly worried about this Necrosphinx really behind my lines now on my right hand side. It's going to get through that Grudge Thrower in the close combat phase, so I've really got to do something about it. Do those warriors turn to face it now? In the end, they choose to help out the Ironbreakers. They charge in to clip the corner of the Skeleton Warrior unit, and I think with this big unit coming in, with my charge and my BSB and so on, that should get us the combat res to wipe out that skeleton unit, and then they can reform to face that monster, which is exactly what happens, of course. I also get a good cannon shot off on that Hero Titan and destroy it. Hurrah! Finally killed something with the cannon. The Longbeards move up with a big 6-inch march, and to sort of try and get a double team on this horde at some point. My gyrocopters, obviously I don't want that horde charging into my Longbeards, just catching them by themselves. So the one gyrocopter moves in to chaff the horde, while the other one goes after the Casket of Souls. Obviously the close combat phase goes my way. We wipe out this unit of Skeleton Warriors. The Dwarf Warriors turn to face the monster, so they're kind of back to back now with my Ironbreakers and my Longbeards facing the horde in the middle. The Warriors sort of facing me and facing the monster that's sort of coming behind my lines. It's still a stalemate, however, with the leash bunker against the gyrocopter, who are still sort of fighting it out there. So I forgot to mention that the organ gun got off a really good shot on the Dwarf turn 4 and killed about 10 Tomb Guard. However, on Tomb King's turn 4, he manages to raise a bunch of them again, and this is just really soul destroying, because I must have just killed about 20 Tomb Guard by now with this organ gun, and yet the unit still looks like it's pretty much on full strength. And although I've managed to kill this Hero Titan, I've really got to do something about this level 4 mage and this Casket of Souls, because he's just got too many dice, he's getting too many of these augments off, and this Tomb Guard unit just can't shift it. So I think I managed to use my Dispel Scroll on I think the Hex that he cast on the Ironbreakers, which has to make them take dangerous terrain and minus their movement. I managed to dispel the extra attack spell, which would have given all these units an extra attack. But he gets total power, unfortunately, on the 5-up ward. So this Tomb Guard unit again has that 5-up ward. I can't do anything about. Sorry, I forgot about the charges. Yeah, so that monster, obviously the Necrosphinx, charges into my Dwarf Warriors on the right hand side, and in the close combat phase manages to kill my BSB. I was really annoyed about that actually, because my BSB has a 4-up ward, and but you got this monster coming that doesn't have too many attacks, the Necrosphinx. I can't remember how many it has. It's something like 5 maybe. But yeah, it manages to kill the BSB. We're steadfast anyway, so we hold. But it's going to be hard to kill this thing because it's toughness 8. So I think we're hitting on 4s, we're hitting on 6s, and we're not in a horde formation anymore. So we don't have that many attacks. So let's see how those warriors do, if they can hold off this monster while we deal with the rest of this Tomb King army. Meanwhile, the horde charges into that gyrocopter and kills it, obviously just chaffing it up so the gyrocopter doesn't flee, it just holds. And my other gyrocopter breaks from that combat, so the wizard bunker with the skeletons, I think they managed to get a wound off on the gyrocopter combined with a rank and so on, and the gyrocopter finally flees. So a little bit of success there for the Tomb Kings in turn 4. So Dwarfs turn 5. and I decide to go in for a massive charge. Now, ordinarily, well, I say ordinarily, in a competitive situation, I probably wouldn't have done this because, of course, the two 20-man units don't get as many attacks as one 40-man unit, right? Because obviously he's got the full horde formation. He's also got hatred from that necrotect. He's also got that 5-up ward spell off on his magic phase. So he really does have a big advantage here, and it probably would have been better just to try and chaff up that unit or back off from that unit for another turn, get another volley fire from the organ gun, and maybe think about tackling it in turn 6 when perhaps I've got a bit more of an advantage, or he doesn't have that 5-up ward spell off on the unit. But we've been sort of we've gone four turns, without our generals getting into combat. So I think it was time to sort of spice up this game a little bit, and we just went for it. So charging the Longbeard, charging the Ironbreakers in the front, and we set up this big combat. How exciting. We got the Gyrocopter going into that Casket of Souls, which destroys it. Really pleased with that, because it's quite tough to, he's got like, three Tomb Guard defending it there, but the Gyrocopter wins the combat and then manages to crumble that Casket of Souls. The other Gyrocopter rallies, and we move on to close combat phase. I issue a challenge with Belagar Ironhammer. Why not? Let's see if we can do this. And I think Brennan was sort of mulling over the idea of accepting with the champion, but then decides to go for it. So we've got Belagar against a Tomb King in a challenge, and we've got lots of dwarves charging into lots of Tomb Guard. Now, I get hatred on my general hates his general, right? So I've got hatred with Belagar Ironhammer. He summons the might of his ancestors to pick up a mighty 8 attacks, but he fluffs it, and it was really disappointing. I got quite a few hits. I got almost no wounds. This Tomb King also had, I think, a 2-up rerollable armor save, which is pretty unfortunate for Belagar, because Belagar gets +1 to wound, but he's still only strength 4, so he doesn't have that much armor piercing. I do have the Runesmith in the unit, so I think it was -2, but he was on a 4-up rerollable. He made a bunch of his armor saves, and I didn't do any wounds in that first round of combat. I think, or maybe I just did 1 wound, I think, out of from 8 attacks. Hitting on 3s, re-rolling. So it was pretty disappointing. And these Tomb Guard are also initiative 3, so they're fighting before my Ironbreakers. Just kill a bunch of dwarves, and I lose combat quite heavily. The Ironbreakers are stubborn, and the Longbeards, who aren't stubborn, end up using their Ancestor Rune. I think it was on a 7. I think I lost combat by 3, and they went down to leadership 7. But I didn't want to risk losing those Longbeards from the fight at this point, so I used the Ancestor Rune, and they stick. On hindsight, it might have been better even to just go in with those Ironbreakers by themselves, because obviously the Ironbreakers have a better save. They've got that 5-up parry, and perhaps I wouldn't have lost combat so heavily, because obviously the Longbeards are easier to kill. But it is what it is, and on the next round of combat, hopefully I can, on the next turn rather, hopefully I can prevent him from getting that ward save off, and obviously he wouldn't have hatred from that necrotect. So let's go to Tomb King's turn 5. Tomb King's turn 5, so the Skeleton Warriors come crashing into the flank of the Longbeards, which is unfortunate for me, because if they were coming into the flank of my Ironbreakers, then no sweat, right? We've got an Oathstone, we've got our parry saves to the flank, we've got a good armor save, so we can shrug off these skeletons, but that's going to be a problem, because they might be able to poke down a few more Longbeards. Close combat phase, we all crash in again. The challenge continues. I think Belagar loses a wound in the challenge, but that continues. And just the amount of attacks that these Tomb Guard are getting, we end up losing the combat again. I think he actually manages to get the +1 attack spell off in the magic phase again, which is just devastating for me because he's just picking up a whole fistful of dice, and then we lose combat quite heavily. The Longbeards break. The Ironbreakers are still stubborn, so they're not going anywhere. I think the skeletons choose not to pursue anyway, so the Longbeards get away, and those skeletons reform, ready to come into the flank of my Ironbreakers. So we move on to turn 6, and I'm thinking, wow, this is getting a bit hairy now. Can I survive until the end of this game? I've got another 2 rounds of combat to go, and try and keep my Ironbreakers in combat to prevent losing a lot of points. So Dwarfs turn 6. Now I do have these 2 gyrocopters, which are floating around at the back of the board there, the Tomb King side of the board. And so they both declare a charge into the rear of this Tomb Guard block. Hopefully, as they come in, being toughness 5 and so on, they can shrug off some of the Tomb Guard attacks and perhaps get that rear charge and some wounds and hopefully swing things into my favour. Meanwhile, the fight rages on with the warriors and the Necrosphinx on the right-hand side. And fortunately, the warriors are victorious. They managed to bring down this Necrosphinx finally. It took about 3 turns of combat, obviously only wounding on 6s, but they do manage to bring it down, which helps me enormously, because obviously if those warriors had broken, now losing the BSB, then that monster would have come crashing into the main combat in the middle. So luckily we prevented that from happening. The challenge continues, and Belegar Ironhammer loses another wound. So he's down to 1 wound now. The ranks of the Ironbreakers are getting thinned out. I think we lose combat again very narrowly, but we stick again, of course, because we're still stubborn leadership 10. And I'm thinking to myself now, geez, these skeletons are coming in my flank turn 6. I've got 1 more turn. Can we hold on? And in the final turn then, Katep and his skeleton henchmen actually charge into the rear of one of the gyrocopters. Interesting, they've gone in for that last turn. Obviously those skeleton warriors going to the flank of my Ironbreakers. And it's all down to this last close combat. I think I used my last rune of spell breaking there to stop one of the buffs. And unfortunately though, in the challenge, that Tomb King, which is obviously fighting with a great weapon, manages to shrug off Belegar's attacks again and then kill Belegar Ironhammer. He's immune to the killing blow, but I think he just only had 1 wound left. And Belegar dies on the last turn. So a bit scary for me, because obviously I'm now losing my stubborn. But fortunately, the combat is a bit more favourable for me. I think I get off a few wounds with the Ironbreakers, and it's either a drawn combat or I think what happened was the Katep's bunker. Or no, I think that the gyrocopter that they charged died, and then of course Katep finds himself out of combat, so they don't get that bonus for the rear charge in the end. I think the Ironbreaker just made a bunch of saves, and then I think we lost combat narrowly, or perhaps it was a drawn combat or something, and we passed our break test. So the game ends with this big combat at a sort of stalemate there. Obviously, even though Belegar's dead, my Longbeards have rallied, so I managed to save the points for my Ironbreakers and Longbeards and my warriors. So my main dwarf blocks haven't been broken at the end of the game, and I've managed to clear out the monsters. So the 3 monsters on the Tomb King side have died. I haven't managed to crack that big horde, of course, or his wizard, but I've got the casket, I've got the monsters, I've got one of those unit of skeleton warriors and those chariots. So I think that's enough for a dwarf victory. So we added up the victory points from this battle line scenario, and I think the dwarves were up by sort of just over 600 points. So it was something like a 13-7 if you're using the 20-0 scoring system. Really enjoyable game, and interesting because we're playing this kind of dwarves kind of backing off and doing some shooting, but at the same time thinking, well, our shooting isn't doing that much, because these monsters have got quite a few wounds, and they're able to sort of come round the flanks and keep out of sight of my cannons. The skeleton warriors are getting raised every turn, so my organ guns are being pretty effective, but ineffective in the grand scheme of things, because the skeletons are just coming back. And it was all down to those final close combats. In a tournament scenario, I might have even just avoided that horde altogether, because of course with the skeletons being able to raise themselves, having hatred and a quite tanky Tomb King leading them, probably would have been better with my army just to avoid that horde. But obviously, it was just a friendly, so we wanted to do that big fight between Belegar and the Tomb King. I actually forgot about Belegar's ASF. He has always strikes first, And it just didn't occur to me that this Tomb King would be initiative 3. I looked it up in the book afterwards, and this Tomb King is only initiative 3. I sort of thought, well, okay, the average Tomb Guard are initiative 3, so a Lord level character would at least be sort of initiative 4 or 5, and so it's not even worth looking it up to see if Belegar gets rerolls, but he would have got rerolls. So that's something I forgot about. I also forgot about the Rune of Slowness on the Ironbreakers, which I don't know would have made a difference, but those Skeleton Warriors obviously made it into combat with those Ironbreakers a little bit earlier. Perhaps if they hadn't made it into combat, then my Warriors would have engaged them, and the Ironbreakers would have been able to perhaps move round a bit, so they could perhaps get into the flank of the main horde. But it's hard to say, and Dwarves are pretty slow, so perhaps that wouldn't have happened anyway. Interesting to face this kind of Tomb King's army, because I'm used to seeing the skeleton horse archers, the fast cavalry, and some of those the constructs. With Tomb Kings, the one I like is the those scorpions, because they're sort of they can come up in the middle of the board, and they're sort of lone models, and so they can really be a nuisance to themselves and get flank and rear charges and stuff. I think they're quite handy. But this was a really sort of big blocks of skeletons marching at you, loads of magic. What are you going to do about it? Because we're going to raise all of our skeletons, and so you're going to be fighting full strength units even if you've got a gun line. So that was pretty scary. But yeah, really enjoyable game. Once again, hope you guys liked it. Leave a comment if you want. Speak to you all soon. Goodbye.